On to the fifth goal, access Unifi AP via SSH. SSH on this Unifi AP is already enabled by default, listening on port 22. Let us configure a port forwarding NAT rule for this one. SSH protocol type is TCP. For destination port range, select SSH. For redirect target IP, enter the Unifi AP IP address 192.168.1.100. For redirect target port, this is still SSH. I'll add a description. This will be Unifi AP SSH, then save. Verify that the link firewall rule is in place. Let us add a new entry for this SSH session at the Remote Desktop Manager application. We'll select SSH shell. I'll name this Unifi AP SSH. For the host, enter the WAN IP 192.168.8.210. The port is already set to default port 22 for SSH. Enter the Unifi AP SSH credential. Launching an SSH session to Unifi AP is a success. Goal number 5 achieved. Next on the list is to access both Windows 11-1 and Windows 11-2 via RDP. We know that both machines are listening on the same default RDP port 3389. And we know as well that server 2022 is also listening on the same RDP port 3389. This is where we apply that port address translation method we've done earlier. Let us plan a port number to use for the two Windows 11s. We already have a port forwarding NAT rule for 3389. And that goes to server 2022, and that is accessible already. I'll use port number 33891 for Windows 11-1. And I'll use port number 33892 for Windows 11-2. Back at the firewall, let us configure port forwarding NAT rules for the two machines. TCP is the protocol type to select. Again, same destination WAN address. For destination port range, select Other so that we can enter a custom port. I'll enter in here 33891. This is again for Windows 11-1 machine. For the redirect target IP, this will be the Windows 11-1 IP address 192.168.1.10. For redirect target port, select MSRDP. And why? It is because Windows 11-1 is still listening on default RDP port 3389. Add a description. Windows 11-1 RDP, verify the linked firewall rule. If you notice there seems to be a duplicate entry, just ignore that for now. I'll go ahead and add the port forwarding NAT rule for Windows 11-2 on port 33892. The redirect target IP is Windows 11-2, local IP address 192.168.10.100. Select MSRDP for the redirect target port. Add a description. I'll name this Windows 11-2 RDP. The link NAT rule has been auto added in here. Looks like we are good with the configuration on this firewall. Set up our remote management application for the 2 RDP sessions. I'll name this Windows 11-1 RDP. For the host, enter the WAN IP 192.168.8.210 and change the default port 3389 to 33891. Enter the user credential of this Windows 11-1. We have a successful RDP session to Windows 11-1 machine. Let us add one more entry for Windows 11-2, same RDP session. I'll name this Windows 11-2 RDP. Host address is still the same, WAN IP 192.168.8.210. Change the port number from default 3389 to 33892. Enter the user credential of Windows 11-2. Launching an RDP session to Windows 11-2 is also a success. Goal 6 completed. For the last goal here, there is a unique requirement that web service hosted on server 2022 must be accessed via HTTPS. We already know that if we create a port forwarding NAT rule for port 443, this will work, but we will lose access on the firewall web admin since it is listening on the same HTTPS port 443 as we have experienced this earlier with the switch. I can think of two solutions here. Solution 1, change the firewall web management port from 443 to let's say 4430. Or solution 2, let's say we bought a new public IP from the ISP. We can allocate this new WAN public IP just for this web service. We'll go through each solutions. On to solution 1. In the firewall web management, go to System, select Advanced. Under Admin Access, HTTPS is selected. In TCP port, default is 443. Let us change this to 4430. Leave everything as default and save. We have a message that this web management will redirect to 4430 in a few seconds. It does redirect as expected, however, the site can't be reached. Why is this happening? Remember, the firewall rule for web management access over WAN is set to the destination port 443 or HTTPS. The change we made on the TCP port from 443 to 4430 in the admin access section will not change the current firewall rule. We need to go back to Windows 11-1 wherein we have firewall web admin access on the LAN. Since we have RDP access already, we can just go to the remote desktop manager. We'll not be able to access this via HTTPS no more on the LAN as well. We need to add :4430 in this URL address. Go to Firewall Rules, under WAN, edit this Firewall Web Management over WAN firewall rule and change the destination port from HTTPS to custom port 4430. After applying the change, in the browser, it automatically connects us back to the Firewall Web Management. Let us proceed adding a port forwarding NAT rule for Web IIS. The destination port range here is HTTPS. The redirect target IP, it is the server 2022 IP 10.10.10.220 hosting the Web IIS. Redirect target port is HTTPS. Add a description, this is for Web IIS. Let us test first in the web browser. This privacy error again is about the certificate not known to the browser yet. We have access to this Web IIS. In the remote desktop application, add a new entry for Web IIS. Select Website Session. Enter the URL address https://192.168.8.210. Web IIS access is a success. We need to edit pfsense firewall URL address since we already changed the management port to 4430. Close the current session, right-click and select Properties, add :4430 for the website address. Click Update. Looks good. So at this remote desktop manager installed on this management PC, we have centralized connection or access to the devices and services. Looks like we are done. But wait, we still have solution 2. I will retain the same HTTPS web management access of the firewall as is. but we'll allocate a new public WAN IP of 192.168.8.211 to the web IIS on port 443. When management PC initiates a connection to the destination WAN IP 192.168.8.211 on port 443, it will be redirected to web IIS. While a connection distant to WAN IP 192.168.8.210 on same port 443 will connect to the firewall web management. To add the secondary WAN IP 192.168.8.211, go to Firewall and select Virtual IPs. Select the type IP alias. Interface is WAN. Address is 192.168.8.211. I'll set this as /32 subnet mask, which makes this a single address. Add a description. I'll put here secondary WAN. Go to the port forwarding NAT rules and edit the web IIS rule. The current configuration is having a destination selected as WAN address. That is the primary WAN IP 192.168.8.210. What we need to do here is to change the destination from WAN address to the secondary WAN 192.168.8.211. The linked firewall rule for web IIS will stay the same. Let's see if we can access web IIS on the secondary WAN IP. Change this URL to 192.168.8.211. We have a successful connection. We still need to change the firewall web admin back to 443. Go to System and select Advanced. Under Admin Access, change the TCP port to the original 443. Then on the RDP session we have on Windows 11-1, remove 4430 and access it as regular HTTPS. Go to Firewall Rules, edit the Firewall Web Management over WAN rule, and change the destination port range back to HTTPS or port 443. Close the pfsense firewall web session, right-click pfsense firewall and select Properties. Edit the URL address by removing colon 4430, then click Update. Close web session for web IIS. Edit this one as well and change the URL address to the secondary WAN IP 192.168.8.211. All good, right? Wait, there is more. I'll demonstrate as well how port forwarding configuration looks like on a Fortigate and Sophos firewall. It will be the same exact topology and same IP addresses, except I'll change the firewall. I'll just do a couple of port forwarding rules to get you started. Let us start with the Fortigate firewall. Here's the Fortigate firewall web management that I access over the WAN IP 192.168.8.210 on HTTPS. By default, web management over WAN is enabled by default. These are the network interfaces configured on this Fortigate. Port 1 is for the WAN, port 2 is for the LAN, and port 3 is for the DMZ. Let us go to Policy and Objects and select Firewall Policy. Only the default implicit deny rule is in here. We'll configure port forwarding for an RDP connection to server 2022. First step here is to go to virtual IPs and create a new virtual IP and then enable port forwarding. I'll name this server 2022 VIP. I'll leave the interface as any. Leave the type as static NAT. For the external IP address / range, this is the WAN IP 192.168.8.210. For map to IPv4 address / range, this is the internal server 2022 IP address 10.10.10.220. Enable port forwarding. Protocol is TCP. Port mapping type is 1-to-1. External service port is RDP port 3389. For map to IPv4 port, this is still the same RDP port 3389. Then click OK. Back to the firewall policy, create a new firewall rule. I'll name this server 2022 RDP. Incoming interface is WAN port 1. Outgoing interface is DMZ port 3, since server 2022 is behind the DMZ interface. Source is all, meaning anything from outside. For the destination, select the configured VIP for server 2022. Schedule is always, service is RDP. Action is accept. Leave inspection mode as flow-based. No need for NAT. Switch it off. No security profiles needed for now. Ensure this policy is enabled and then click OK. Firewall rule is configured with server 2022 VIP. Back to the remote desktop manager application. Double-click to launch a session. RDP connection to server 2022 is a success. While we are here, let us launch Linksys Switch web session. URL is https://192.168.8.210:4433. This will not load the page since we don't have a VIP and a firewall rule yet. We'll create another virtual IP for the Linksys Switch web management. I'll name this Switch VIP. For the external IP or range, still the same WAN IP address 192.168.8.210. For map to IPv4 address or range, this is the Linksys Switch internal IP 192.168.1.205. Notice there is a red text saying conflicts with the external IP of another VIP. We can just ignore this for now and this will go away once you completed the configuration. Enable port forwarding. External service port is 4433. The red text above has gone away. Map to IPv4 port is 443. Then click OK. Create a new firewall policy. I'll name this switch web management. Incoming interface is WAN port 1. Outgoing interface is LAN port 2. Source is all. For the destination, select the switch VIP. For service, this will be HTTPS or port 443, which the Linksys switch is listening at. No need for NAT, click OK. At the Remote Desktop Manager application, Linksys switch has the same settings as before. Launch a web session and it is accessible. Last thing I want to show here is how to configure a secondary WAN IP 192.168.8.211 to access web IIS via HTTPS. First thing we need to do here is to add the secondary WAN IP under the main WAN port 1. Go to Network, select Interfaces, edit WAN port 1. Switch on the secondary IP address. Click Create New. Enter 192.168.8.211/32 for the IP/netmask. No need for administrative access, then click OK. We can proceed now creating a new virtual IP for web IIS. For the external IP address, this is the secondary WAN IP 192.168.8.211. For map to IPv4 address, enter the server 2022 IP 10.10.10.220, which is hosting the web IIS. Enable port forwarding. External service port is 443. Map to IPv4 port is still on port 443. Create a new firewall policy. Select Web IIS VIP for the destination. Launch Web IIS. Connection is successful. I think you got the idea now how to configure port forwarding in Fortigate. We just need to create a virtual IP and enable port forwarding. Then create a firewall policy and ensure to add the created virtual IP in the destination field. Now we'll change this Fortigate to Sophos firewall. Sophos firewall web management is by default listening on port 4444, as you can see in here. Here are the network interfaces configured on the Sophos firewall. Port A is for LAN, Port B is for WAN, Port C is for the DMZ. Sophos Firewall Web Management is listening on TCP port 4444. I think we should have no issue accessing the link to switch web management on the native HTTPS port 443 from outside because there is no conflict now with the firewall web management, right? We'll see how it goes. I'll set up first port forwarding for an RDP session to server 2022. Under rules and policies, this is where we can configure our firewall rule and NAT rule. Let us start with the NAT rule. Click NAT rules. There is one default SNAT or source NAT rule here for outbound traffic. Click add NAT rule. There are two options, new NAT rule and server access assistant DNAT or destination NAT. Server access assistance DNAT is a wizard type of setup, but for now we'll select new NAT rule. Rule status is on by default. I'll name this server 2022 RDP DNAT. I'll place this at the top position. For the original source, I'll select any, which means anything coming from outside or any IP from the internet. For the original destination, this is the destination WAN IP address, or we can select the auto-created object name port B, which is the WAN port with an assigned WAN IP of 192.168.8.210. For the original service, this is the incoming RDP port 3389, but there is no object for it yet. We'll click Add and select Services. I'll name this RDP underscore port 3389. Select TCP/UDP for the type, TCP for the protocol. Leave the source port as default. In the destination port, enter 3389, then save. For the translated source, SNAT or source NAT, leave this as original. This SNAT is mainly used for outbound traffic. For the translated destination DNAT, this is where we redirect the traffic to the internal server 2022 IP address 10.10.10.220. There is an object name already created for server 2022. I'll just select this. For the translated service path or port address translation, this will stay as original, same as the original service on port 3389. For the inbound interface, we'll select port B, which is the WAN interface or port. For outbound interface, leave it as any. There is an option to create loopback rule, which is the same as NAT reflection in pfSense. An option to create reflexive rule. We don't need these two options for now. If we go with that DNAT assistance wizard, these two optional rules will be auto-created. No need to change the advanced settings, click Save. We need to create a firewall rule to complete the configuration, allowing inbound traffic from WAN going to DMZ. Go to Firewall Rules, click Add Firewall Rule and select New Firewall Rule. Rule status is on. I'll name this server 2022 RDP. Action is accept. Check this box if you want to log the firewall traffic. Select top for rule position and none for rule group. For the source zone, select WAN, so incoming traffic to the WAN port B. For source networks and devices, leave it any, so this is any IP address coming from the internet. For during scheduled time, leave it as all the time. For the destination zone, select DMZ since server 2022 is behind the DMZ interface. For destination networks, we have to select here the destination WAN address or the interface port B object that has the assigned WAN IP 192.168.8.210. For services, select the object name we created earlier for RDP port 3389. We have options here to add security features, but we'll just go with a plain firewall rule without any filtering or security features attached to this one. In the Remote Desktop Manager application, launch the Server 2022 RDP, and we have a successful RDP connection to Server 2022. Let us test this Linksys switch while we are here. The URL configured on this is https://192.168.8.210:4433, same as before. We put this on 4433 again because the Firewall Web Management, pfSense and Fortigate were listening on native HTTPS or port 443. Sophos Web Management is listening on port 4444. So this means there is no conflict, right? I'll remove :4433 and access it directly on HTTPS. I'm just checking here if the Sophos firewall has a service on default HTTPS or 443. It did pull up a VPN portal page here. It appeared that Sophos firewall is listening on 443 or HTTPS for the VPN portal access. I thought we can use the native HTTPS or 443 to access the Linksys switch. We have to put it back to 4433 then. When launching this on 4433, we don't have access yet as there is no port forwarding configuration in place. Let us configure port forwarding for Linksys Switch Web Management access. Go to NAT Rules, click Add NAT Rule and select New NAT Rule. I'll name this switch DNAT. Rule position is at the top. For the original source, leave it as any, meaning any IP address coming from the internet. Original destination here is again the WAN IP 192.168.8.210, which is on port B. Select object name port B. For the original service, let us create an object name for port 4433. Click Add and select Services. I'll name this switch underscore 4433. Type is TCP/UDP. Protocol is TCP. Leave the source port as default. For the destination port, enter 4433, then save. Leave the translated source SNAT as original. For the translated destination DNAT, this is the internal IP of the switch. I'll add an object name, click Add and select IP address. I'll name this Linksys switch. IP version is IPv4. Type is IP. Enter the switch internal IP address 192.168.1.205, then click Save. For the translated service path, select HTTPS since the switch web management is listening on this native HTTPS port 443. "4433" will be translated to 443. The inbound interface here is WAN port B. Leave outbound interface as any, then save. Next is to create a firewall rule. Click Add Firewall Rule and select New Firewall Rule. I'll name this as Switch Web Management. Action is accept. Log the firewall traffic. Select top for the rule position and none for the rule group. Select WAN for the source zone. Leave it as any for the source networks and devices. Leave it as all the time for during scheduled time. For the destination zone, select LAN since the switch is behind the LAN interface. For the destination network, select the object name port B, that is the WAN IP 192.168.8.210. For the services, select the object name for port 4433, then click Save. Back at the Remote Desktop Manager, double-click Linksys Switch to launch a web session, and we have access to it. Last thing to show here is the use of secondary WAN IP 192.168.8.211 to access web IIS on 443 or HTTPS. To add a second WAN IP, go to Network, then Interfaces. Click Add Interface, select Add Alias. For the physical interface, select the main WAN port B. IP version is IPv4. For IPv4/netmask, enter 192.168.8.211 and set the mask to /32. Then save. The secondary WAN IP 192.168.8.211 has an object autonamed as port B:0, which is a sub-interface of the main WAN port B. In creating a port forwarding rule, we should select this object name port B:0. Back to NAT rules, let us create a new NAT rule for the web IIS. For the original destination, this will be the secondary WAN IP. Select object name port B:0. For the original service, select HTTPS. For the translated destination DNAT, this is the server 2022 internal IP. For the translated service path, this will remain as original on HTTPS port 443. The inbound interface is still the main WAN port B. Next is to create a firewall rule for web IIS. For the destination network, select port B:0, which is the object name for the WAN IP 192.168.8.211. For services, select HTTPS. At the Remote Desktop Manager application, launching a web session for Web IIS is a success. That is all I want to share on how to configure port forwarding. I hope it helps. Take care and see you on the next video.